Welcome to Hard Talk. I'm Stephen Sackur. It is a good time to be an economist who swims against the tide of conventional wisdom. After all, the last decade has seen classical economics take a beating. The great financial crash wasn't supposed to happen, nor was the prolonged Eurozone stagnation. And now the liberal economic consensus tells us Brexit will be a disaster. But why should we believe it? Well, we shouldn't, according to my guest, the influential contrarian economist Steve Keen. But amid all the argument, do any economists deserve our trust? Steve Keen, welcome to Hard Talk.
Delighted to be here again.
You describe yourself as an anti-economist. Does that mean that you just listen to what all of the sort of bastions of economic collective wisdom say, from the US Fed to the UK Treasury to the IMF, and you just think, I'll say exactly the opposite?
That wouldn't be a bad strategy, but no. There's been an alternative strands in economics throughout its history, going right back to the days before we even had what we called economics, back in the days of William Petty and so on. And I've been part of that contrarian tradition, which you can probably date back to about 1810.
Right,
and
but things have changed a little bit since 1810.
Yes.
I mean, the orthodoxy has changed somewhat.
It's changed dramatically. It's swept around. The orthodoxy we have now really began in the 1870s. But that orthodoxy fundamentally saw capitalism as being a system that tends towards equilibrium. Now, it wasn't because the people who wrote this stuff believed it. I'm talking about Jevons and Marshall and so on back in those days. But they didn't believe it was possible to analyse the economy unless you assumed it was an equilibrium. So what was a technical choice for them back then effectively became a religion in the 20th century. And that's when my school really departed and said, capitalism, whatever else it might have as a strength, equilibrium is not one of them.
But are you a capitalist?
In a fundamental sense, yes, I am. I'm a great fan of entrepreneurs and innovators. I think capitalism is probably the second best social system in history for bringing about innovation, and that's the main thing we can say in favour of it. The first best by being back in Cro-Magnon days, by the way. So it's dramatically better than feudalism, certainly better than state socialism, and I think that's inherent. It's not just because of Stalin. Capitalism does give you more innovation, but it also does give you financial bubbles and Ponzi schemes, and that's the main thing that I'm attacking in policy terms.
Right, and I want to get to the nitty-gritty of where you see the particular problems and where you might see things like Ponzi schemes developing again. But before we get there, just one more question about your mindset, because it just seems to me quite important to establish how you think. You call yourself a contrarian, and I come back to this idea that there's something knee-jerk and very predictable about being a contrarian, because the whole idea is that you take whatever the consensus is, and right now the consensus, going back to the beginning of my first question, the consensus is clearly around a form of liberal economics that perhaps the IMF epitomises. Your knee-jerk reaction is simply to think always that they're wrong.
No, I can analyse what they say and work out whether they're right or wrong. They can be right by accident, so in a lot of ways most conventional economists these days are in favour of governments running budget deficits, for example, which is not what you see coming out of the political class. So I find myself happily signing petitions that Paul Krugman might also have his name on exactly the same issue. So I'm not contrarian about every particular point. It's really this approach of analysis. How do you think about capitalism? What questions do you ask yourself about the social system that direct then what information you look for to try to understand how it operates? They ask the question, can a disaggregated, deregulated system of markets reach equilibrium? Interesting question. They prove that it's not the case, as it happens. My question is, what caused the Great Depression? And can we avoid having another one? I think that's a better question.
Right, well, it's a very big question, and I don't want to ignore it, but I want to start actually with something very specific and then sort of actually get to the bigger picture. And the specific thing I want to get to, because you've made quite a lot of noise about it and you've swum against the tide in doing so, is Brexit. Why do you believe that, again, the collective wisdom from all of the organisations I've already mentioned, but in particular the UK government itself, some of the most respected economists here in the Institute for Fiscal Studies and elsewhere too, they all say that the Brexit decision is going to have a material and damaging effect on the UK economy. How can you be so sure they're wrong?
Well, I'm not. Actually, my reason for voting for Brexit was not because I thought it was going to be better for the English economy than Remain. There are good arguments that there can be a certain amount of damage to the economy from leaving an institutional structure like the European Union. My main reason for voting for Brexit was, I suppose I call myself the Groucho Marxist question. I'm in a club, do I want to be here? And the answer was no, because I think the EU is an incredibly, not only an effective club, but a dangerous club for the health of Europe. And it's going to fall apart at some stage. It might as well start with a polite exit by the English rather than a rude one by the French.
Well, for a start, we should say the British, not the English.
Sorry about that.
And that's okay.
I'm still learning.
But the point is this, we look at the impact of Brexit, we see, and all the surveys show it, from business confidence to investment decisions, we see already that the impact of uncertainty is quite profound, and that all of the growth forecasts for the future have been downsized. Britain is going to suffer as a result.
It's having some pain. I mean, some of that pain is necessary. A large part of it is you need to unwind the housing bubble you've got here, which is as bad as the one that I come from back in Sydney. There are elements like that that have to happen. But in terms of the current impact, it's all upon uncertainty. Now, are we trying to say we were certain before Brexit and uncertain after? It's the age of uncertainty on that front.
Well, there are certain certainties that we lived with and that actually the British economy benefited from. One was the single market. It meant tariff-free trade right across the European Union.
That's hugely important, because now, if we actually negotiate the same deal the Americans have, we go from having no tariff whatsoever.
Yeah, but you said if, and that's the nature of the uncertainty. You've said very confidently, I'm sure that we're going to get, if we go into a sort of third-party deal with the European Union, I'm sure we're going to get a great tariff agreement with them, and indeed with the rest of the world too. How can comes back to the credibility of economists. How can you be sure?
No, because tariff walls used to be a big issue back in the 50s and 60s. And one thing my anti-profession has done is demolish tariff walls around the world. Tariffs used to average 30%. You know what the average tariff is between the America and the European Union now? 2%.
You know what the likely tariff is if we go to this third-party status on cars, for example? One of the most important exports from the UK, at least 10%. 10% on the price of a car is a really big deal.
And our currency has fallen by 15 and 20%. There are ups and downs in both of these processes, and a large part of what's happened to England in the last 30 or so years, certainly in comparison to Germany, is a deindustrialisation of the country. Now, partly that's because you've had an overvalued exchange rate, in my opinion. That exchange rate plunged after Brexit and is likely to remain low. So, yes, you're going to face maybe a tariff on cars of 10%, but you're looking at a general reduction in your export prices of 20%. So there are swings and roundabouts here which weren't taken account of by the mainstream.
Look at the way the British economy works. I mean, a very significant chunk of national GDP comes from the City of London, from the financial sector, banking, insurance, and all the rest that goes with it. There are significant institutions like Deutsche Bank who are already saying they are fundamentally reviewing their investment commitment, strategic commitment to the UK because of the Brexit decision. Financial services are going to take a real hit.
Not as big as people make out, because the main reason that the financial sector is located here is, number one, the language you and I are both using. English is the language of international trade. It won't become German or French or Italian or anything else in the meantime. Also, most contracts are negotiated in English law, and that's a major strength that the financial sector gets out of locating here that it won't get in Frankfurt. Now, they'll talk about it. They're good at talking up how deadly the world's going to be ruined if they leave the country tomorrow. The financial sector is very good at causing a panic. But in fact, making a final action, deciding to move all their facilities from here to Frankfurt, no, I can't see that happening. I can see them changing the weighting, but that's
they're business people,
stuff.
and they have to take seriously the words that come out of Paris, for example, or the words that come out of the mouth of the German finance minister, Wolfgang Schäuble. These are people in Europe who are saying, look, apart from anything else, to ensure the stabilisation of the rest of the European Union, to ensure we stay together, we have to send a very clear message about Britain that if you leave, you suffer the consequences.
And look what they've done to Greece and Spain. That is not the behaviour of a democratic system. That is authoritarian behaviour.
Well, you can call it what you like, but you're not a politician, you're an economist. You have to calculate.
I'm not going to be an economic Chamberlain.
What do you mean?
I'm not going to be somebody who says we have to stay there for the sake of peace in our time and lock ourselves into a policy system which is actually causing the collapse of Europe. That's what the European Union, in particular the euro, is doing. The sooner the euro is ended, the better for the state of the global economy, and as painful as it will be in transition, the better it will be for the countries of Europe.
Just a final point on Europe, and then we'll move on. But one of your best friends in the world of economic thinking is the former Greek finance minister, Yanis Varoufakis. I've had him in the studio, and he said, you know what, clearly I have a lot of problems with the European Union, but I still think fundamentally it would be the wrong and a dangerous decision for the UK to leave the European
That's where
Union.
Yanis and I differ on a political front rather than economic. Yanis has got a tendency, and I admire him for it, trying to find ways that currently dysfunctional systems can be made to work. That's what he tried to do with what he called his modest proposal for reforming the euro, which, if it had been taken on board, would have been far, far better for Greece and for most of Europe than what actually was done. I just don't think you can persuade Wolfgang Schäuble to think outside the ordo-liberal framework he's inside. And it's like telling somebody, reform a marriage from inside. Don't leave your husband, persuade him not to bash you anymore. I'm sorry, from what you're even saying here is they're going to bash us more if we try to leave, so let's not leave. That is a very failed strategy for the long term if you're going to continue getting bashed as a result of staying where you are.
And your analysis is that the European Union, and in particular the Eurozone, are absolutely doomed. No question in your mind.
I believe so. And going right back to Wynne Godley, another classic contrarian English economist, who wrote in 1992 that given the way the euro has been defined, the only outcome is going to be immigration as an alternative to starvation or death. Now, he wrote that in 1992 when the ink was still drying on the Maastricht Treaty, and people would have seen him as a complete extremist. That is one of the most prescient articles ever written. That's the state we're in now. I'm simply carrying on from Wynne Godley's work and saying we should never have joined, the euro should never have been created, let's decreate it.
Funnily enough, while you predict meltdown for the European Union, that isn't the real driver of your conviction that there is going to be, before too long, another financial crisis across the world. I mean, that is driven less by a particular political event like the breakup of the European Union for you. It's driven much more by your analysis that the world is still drowning in debt.
Private debt. That's right, and that's what's ignored by the mainstream, which is one reason why I call myself an anti-economist. They are slowly coming around to realising the importance of private debt, but fundamentally they ignore it and say government debt's the problem. My argument is, and it comes from Hyman Minsky's work and Irving Fisher before him, is that private debt is a major, the growth in private debt is a major source of demand in the economy, but that demand comes with the cost that your debt level rises. And there's a tendency in capitalism for the debt level to rise over time to the point where you have so much debt that you can't service it anymore and you have a crisis like we're going through now.
Well, you say can't service it anymore, but the fact is it's very easy to service because right now interest rates are lower than they've ever been before. In some countries they're pretty much negative. And also, governments are making the money supply more sort of easy to get your hands on than ever before.
I wish the last one were true, because they're pumping up the money. They're pumping up the money in the banking system's own internal circulation, not in our actual pockets. They should be doing.
Well, it has a knock-on effect. That's the argument.
No, it doesn't. Nothing like it. This is again bad economics.
Well, they wouldn't be doing quantitative easing unless they were convinced that actually printing money as they do,
yes, they're convinced by
it reaches the real economy.
And they're wrong. They're convinced by it, and they're wrong. And the Bank of England is now saying that in its own research papers. If you go back to their thing about money creation in the modern economy, they say boosting reserves does not create extra money in the private monetary system. So it's a fail. It's not a successful policy.
Well, you're absolutely convinced they're wrong, but let us be honest, you've been wrong too. You look, I mean, this... I was going to say obsession, that's rude. Let's say preoccupation you have with private debt and levels of private debt around the world.
Yeah.
You've had it for some time. I mean, you had it in your home country, Australia. You said back in 2010 that Australia's property market was heading for a crash. You said prices are going to fall by up to 40%. And because of the degree to which Australians are leveraged into their property market, it's going to kill the Australian economy. Well, you're dead wrong. Australia hasn't had a recession for, what, 25 years?
And what it's done to avoid that recession is to borrow an additional 50% of GDP over the debt level it had back in 2008.
And so what, I would say, because the Australian economy is motoring at 3% growth right now. It's got unemployment of 5%, inflation rate of 1%. Australians, by and large, are pretty darn happy.
And so were Americans in 2007, up to July. These things come to a crunch, and the reason that isn't just a case of servicing...
You said they were coming to crunch 6 years ago.
And they borrowed their way out of it.
You said, in fact, I don't mind embarrassing you. You said, I am going to walk from Canberra to Australia's highest mountain, 225 kilometres, if I'm wrong on this issue, and you were dead wrong. You had to put your walking boots on and take the hike.
The expiry of that particular bet is 2023.
Well, why did you've done the walk already?
Shut the property lobby up. It worked very effectively.
I think they felt that you were saying that the crash was coming, and that's why you felt that you had to...
As soon as you say property is going to fall over, the property lobby goes for you like a mad dog. And I went in as an academic expecting to have even academic standard debates, and they can be pretty nasty. But what the property lobby does to fight anybody who goes against their mantra is to attack on any ground.
You're the guy who told me that you were never going to appease, you were never going to tailor your message.
I didn't appease. I got up on the second page of the Sydney Morning Herald, courtesy of that walk, and rubbed their noses in it.
All right, well, let's talk China then. You know, if we're going around Steve Keen's predictions and the degree to which they're not coming true, you, for quite a while, have been saying that the Chinese economy is heading for a massive fall too. Right now it's growing at a pretty steady 7% a year.
Do you know what the unemployment rate is in China right now?
Well, I don't know that anybody can believe the statistics coming out of China.
It's 4.09% and has been for the last 7 years. The statistics that matter that are coming out of China are talking about a crunch, and the government's response to that is to try to pump the economy up again. Now, I do say they can manage to do that because they have such an amalgam of a private and a state system. They can flip from private funding to government funding very easily. But they still have massively overinvested, and they are still suffering a dramatic decline in demand in many sectors of the economy, and they can't sustain the same rate of growth.
What is, for you, an acceptable level of privately held debt, individual and business held debt, in a sustainable economy? What level can it be?
About 60 to 80% of GDP.
60 to 80%?
Yep.
Well, most countries are well over 100%.
Exactly. If you look at England...
but they're not all collapsed. The thing is, you're Mr. Doom and Gloom, but things aren't as bad around the world generally as you suggest they ought to be.
What has happened, and largely the one reason they're not so bad is because countries outside Europe are actually doing government spending despite talking about running a surplus. And it's good that they're doing that spending. But what's actually happened is credit demand has collapsed. If you look at the rate of growth of debt, which is credit, change in debt is credit, that was running in America at about 15% of GDP on average for the 5 years before the crisis. It's now running at less than 3% on average. There's been a collapse in demand, and that's why we've got stagnation around the globe. So we're all getting ourselves into that situation. Australia and China are approaching it right now.
Well, funnily enough, your list of the countries we should expect the next massive new debt crisis to begin in include, well, China and Australia, you have as numbers 1 and 2. But then you go through countries that I think many of us would find very surprising. Sweden, you say? South Korea?
Yep.
Canada, and perhaps most bizarre of all, Norway, one of the richest countries in the world with a massive sovereign wealth fund and oil reserves and gas reserves to die for.
I know. What I'm going on is the level of debt they've accumulated, how fast that debt is growing, which tells you how important credit is to their economy, and the trend in that credit, which is actually negative in most of those countries. The interesting one to me is actually South Korea. I didn't expect to see that. South Korea has really had a housing bubble. And that housing bubble has got it over the collapse in demand it's getting for its exports to China right now.
How long then till this catastrophe strikes?
It won't be a catastrophe on the same scale as the American one because it's many more diversified economies.
Well, yeah, but frankly, if some of those 7 all went at the same time, we'd be talking about a total global loss of confidence.
We're talking about countries which are equivalent to about 1/3 of global GDP. They won't all go at the one time, but if they did, yes, it would be off the scale of the American downturn in 2008.
So is that a possibility, or are you just enjoying the publicity that comes with saying, oh my God, the roof's falling?
I think it's a possibility. I put my neck out on that particular book, which is coming out next year, as you know, to actually have those predictions there, so if I'm proven wrong, it's in print.
So there's another walk. You're going up another mountain if you get it wrong.
Well, I might try the English ones. They're about as low as the Australian.
Now, let's, before we end, get to your prescription for what works. You say quantitative, if one generalizes around the world, central banks have essentially used quantitative easing to try and stimulate their economies. You say that doesn't work. It doesn't trickle down or filter through to real people making real spending decisions. So what does work?
People's quantitative easing, as it's been termed by groups like Positive Money in England and so on, which rather than buying bonds off the banks, which just puts money in the bank's reserve accounts at the central bank, buy debt or however you get hold of it.
Well, you talk about writing off debt.
Yeah, I do.
You think governments should go to people who've spent too much money buying new tellies and whatever else, and you say just give them a pass and write off their debt.
No, I'm saying what I call a modern debt tribute, where it goes to people whether or not they're in debt, because if you do just the debt, people who went into debt, you're rewarding moral hazard, which is a good point. But the government...
Imagine what Wolfgang Schäuble would say to you when you say to him, you know what, we're just going to give everybody money.
Wolfgang Schäuble doesn't understand money. Wolfgang Schäuble and mainstream economists in particular are still coming to grips with what money actually is and how it's
dare
created.
you say that to a man who's overseen one of the most successful periods in the German economy of, you know,
Because of the euro.
decades.
The euro has given them a 9% trade surplus. They're cauterising southern Europe with a monumental...
Oh, you mean they're pure leeches and parasites?
Their surplus went from 0% of GDP as a trade surplus to 9% during the term of the euro.
Right,
Without the euro, they would be in a totally different situation.
So you don't regard Germany as a model for anything good at all? And
Nothing, we can't duplicate it. We can't all run a trade surplus.
Okay. Well, not everybody can, clearly, because people have got to buy as well as sell.
That's why the balance is zero for trade.
Yeah. All right. So you're saying, no, we don't just write off people's private debt, we actually give money to everybody.
Which
so
then
is that
people-
what they call helicopter money?
Yes,
You just
which-
chuck it out the back of a helicopter
Which
and say, here's money.
people in debt would have to use to pay their debt down. Those not in debt get a
How
cash
do you mean they'd have
injection.
to? You'd force them to?
You'd actually go through bank accounts. Put it into somebody's bank account. If there's debt, it cancels the debt. If there's no debt, they get a cash injection. Balance it using open market operations, just stop too large an increase in the money supply occurring, but use that to actually boost domestic activity and reduce private debt. Because the crisis...
Sorry, forgive me for sounding puzzled, but you think this works for governments which are running massive public deficits and indeed massive national debt as well? You know, however indebted the government is, they still give out money to everybody.
The main danger is the trade deficit. That's the one you've got to look at. That's the most important deficit you need to control. But governments should run deficits most of the time. The mistake we make is believing that government should run a surplus or be balanced. But governments are one of two ways of creating money. The banks are the other way. If the government doesn't create money, we can borrow too much from the banks and end up in the sort of crisis we're in now.
You, I think, would have to admit that at the moment this idea of helicopter money being the key to getting governments out of, well, not governments, but nations out of slow growth, it's still somewhat controversial.
Funnily, it wouldn't be anywhere near as successful if Milton Friedman hadn't invented the phrase himself some 40 years ago. So I've got to thank Uncle Milton for that particular one.
What I'm getting at now, toward the end of this interview, is whether anybody should take anything any economist says seriously.
That's a very good question, and in my book Debunking Economics, I start by saying if we all committed collective harakiri, including me, the world would be a better place.
Yeah, because you know you're somewhat cheeky in that you slag off all other economists and say, you know what, the profession that I'm part of has been wrong for so long. That's why I'm an anti-economist. But in the end, you're still an economist.
Yeah, I'm trying to get us to think in the modern, complex systems way about the economy. Catch up with what's happened in genuine sciences that have adopted the idea of the world being a complex system and having to think about things which are dynamic, out of equilibrium, and for God's sake, take money into account in economic theory, which currently they do not do. If we do all those, I'll become an economist.
I mean, there's a serious point here about whether we can afford to listen to experts anymore. You know, during the Brexit debate, Michael Gove, a senior Brexit politician from the Conservative Party, said, you know what, we've been listening to experts for too long. And in particular in economics, where, you know, it's nominally a science, but it's so much predicated on human behaviour, it seems that forecasting the future is pretty much impossible.
It's chicken entrail stuff. But the thing is, every time you hop on a plane...
It's not presented that way, though.
No, I know. That's why I'm saying it as an anti-economist in your show. But if you look, every time you hop inside a plane, you trust the engineers knew how to design something aerodynamically so to take off and land safely. And you don't even need to think about it because every damn time it works. Okay? Engineers are experts. Scientists are experts. Climate scientists are experts. Economists, unfortunately, wear that mantle without having earned it because the economy will tick over whether the economists write a good theory or a bad theory. There's a certain momentum to the economy. But they've led us into a very bad alley, which I've been warning about for 4 decades now.
In the end, I'm wondering why I should believe either of you.
Believe that we need to reform economics first. That we can agree on. Then say, how do we reform it? And then it comes down to a question of how do you model the macroeconomy? What do you do? And economics can learn a lot from other sciences that has been neglecting, in particular what I'm calling complex systems analysis, which has grown up in the last 40 years ever since a guy called Lorenz built the first non-equilibrium complex model of the weather, which we now watch in grand detail on our TV shows every night for the weather report. The accuracy of meteorology has improved dramatically over the last 5 decades. The economics has ignored what's happened there. They should borrow what they have done and apply them in the structures of the economy.
Interesting thought to end on. Steve Keen, thank you very much for being on Hard Talk.
Thank you indeed.